Hello again, and happy Sunday local time from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. New Zealand's Prime Minister and the country's Labour Party's leader, Miss Jacinda Ardern, is celebrating her re-election as the country's Prime Minister. Ironically, still in 2017, the centre-right National Party had actually won more seats than the Labour Party. However, surprisingly, the right-wing and nationalist New Zealand First Party decided shortly after those elections to form a coalition with Miss Ardern's Labour Party, making her the country's first female prime minister, and then she was only 37 years old. As had been predicted by numerous pre-election opinion polls, New Zealand First fell below the 5% threshold that would have guaranteed it minimal representation in the parliament under New Zealand's mixture of first past the post and proportional representation that has been in place since the 1996 parliamentary elections. Interestingly, New Zealand, just like the neighboring Australia, elects its parliament every 3 years. Anyway, New Zealand First also failed to win a single constituency seat, so its number of seats went at one stroke from 9 to 0. And because the Labour Party managed to win almost 50% of the vote, it was able to gain an absolute majority in New Zealand's parliament, therefore freeing it from the obligation to form a coalition government either with the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers New Zealand or with the Green Party. It remains to be seen, of course, how long this popularity will last. Obviously, enough of the participating New Zealand voters were willing to give Prime Minister Ardern the credit for her early and decisive lockdown measures and social distancing, mask wearing, facial mask wearing, and other measures that have been largely responsible for the fact that even today, New Zealand has under 2,000 COVID cases and only 25 deaths. So US President Donald Trump's claims to the contrary, he did not act early, while Prime Minister Ardern definitely did. In the last one of the three televised debates, the National Party's new leader and opposition leader, Judith Collins, criticized Prime Minister Ardern for not having done enough to reduce the child poverty in New Zealand, but essentially Ardern brushed off that criticism, claimed that she had done much. And generally speaking, Mrs. Collins suffered from the impression that she was a stand-in leader because her predecessor had to resign earlier this year and the National Party was desperate to replace him with a credible and electable leader. While Mrs. Collins was able to get re-elected to the New Zealand Parliament, she was unable to save her party from a massive defeat. Probably for the first time in its history, or at least for the first time in decades, the National Party won or got under 30% of the vote. If New Zealand had employed a pure British-style first-past-the-post electoral system, then this would have given the National Party probably no more than maybe 20 to 25% of the seats. But because of the mixed member proportional electoral system, the National Party was, according to the preliminary results, able to get 35 seats. One of the key themes of the election campaign of Mrs. Collins had been the claim that should Prime Minister Ardern be re-elected, she would implement the wealth tax demanded by the Greens, because still at the time of that time of the election campaign, it seemed likely that the Labour Party would win these parliamentary elections with a plurality, the largest number of seats, but not quite. And in any case, Prime Minister Ardern had rejected those claims. There was a brief religious controversy. Judith Collins, who self-identified as a liberal Anglican, the Anglican Church is one of the largest Christian denominations in the largely secular New Zealand. According to the 2018 New Zealand census, almost half of the respondents indicated that they have no particular religious affiliation. Judith Collins claimed to have had a Christian conversion experience, a come to Jesus moment, and her secular critics then accused her of exploiting her faith, Christian faith, to get votes. So while in countries like the United States it's common for the major parties' candidates, in many other democracies it is considered somehow a violation of the separation of church and state, or religion and state. Imagine someone in France doing that, because France is one of the most secularized Western countries. And even in my distant native land, Finland, it is considered inappropriate, or at least not so mainstream, to talk openly about one's religious faith, especially if it happens to be the Christian faith. So what challenges lie ahead? Of course, getting rid of the pandemic, if there is a second wave, let alone a third wave, and if there are many more cases and deaths, which of course no one, including myself, hopes for, then Prime Minister Ardern is likely to lose a significant portion of her popularity. If New Zealand's economy will not pick up, new parliamentary term 2020 to 2023, if at first it will even be in a recession, and only in 2023 will it start to gradually grow, maybe to the tune of 1 to 2 or 2 to 3%, that would also be a disadvantage for Prime Minister Ardern in her possible search or probable search for a third. But is living with a man and their daughter. And of course, if there were scandals involving any of her key cabinet ministers, like the finance minister, interior minister, foreign minister, elected or chose a more electable, preferably a younger politician who would be able to win back many of the moderate centrist voters who abandoned the National Party in this election, that could be a disadvantage for Miss Ardern. Okay, let's look at the preliminary election results according to the Wikipedia article on the election. So the Labour Party got about 49.1% of the vote, a swing of 12.2% compared to the 2017 New Zealand parliamentary elections, and gained 18 seats for a total of 64. The National Party slumped to 26.8%, a dramatic drop of 17.6%, getting only a total of 35 seats, a drop of 21. The Association of Consumers and Taxpayers New Zealand, which is a classical liberal libertarian party, rose dramatically to 8% of the vote, a gain of 7.5%, and got 10 seats, a gain of 9 seats. The Green or Environmentalist Party got 7.6% of the vote, a gain of 1.3%, which gave it 10 seats, a gain of 2. The Maori Party, representing New Zealand's native people, got 1% of the vote, a loss of 0.2%, but despite that it gained a seat. The New Zealand First Party suffered from the perceived selling of its principles because of its controversial coalition government with the Labour Party, because New Zealand First is a nationalist right-wing party, which ideologically usually stands much closer to the National Party than to the Labour Party. But apparently, the New Zealand First Party's longtime leader, Winston Peters, had personal differences two great personal differences with Bill English, the former national prime minister, for him to team up with the National Party in 2017. So the New Zealand First Party slumped to 2.7% of the vote, a loss of 4.5%, and it lost all of its 9 seats. The electorate or single member seats were divided as follows. The Labour Party got 43 of them, the National Party got 26, and the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers New Zealand, the Green Party and the Maori Party got 1 each. The proportional or list party list seats were divided as follows. The Labour Party got 21 of them, the National Party got 9, so did the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers New Zealand and the Green Party. So some analyses here. Out her front gate in Sandringham, bound for Labour headquarters, the Prime Minister was greeted by raucous cheers as the crowd gathered close in to greet her. She declared, "Tonight New Zealand has shown the Labour Party its greatest support in at least 50 years." She acknowledged voters who had switched allegiances from National. "For those amongst you who may not have supported Labour before, to you I say thank you. We will not take your support for granted." Labour was committed to key infrastructure, 100% renewable electricity, the environment, and supporting those at risk, according to Prime Minister Ardern. Over the next 3 years, there is much work to do. We will build back better from the COVID crisis, better, stronger, with the answers to the things New Zealand already faces. Ardern would not say whether or not she still intended to invite the Green Party to be part of the government or what role they might have. She said many voters who had never voted for Labour before had done so to give the party the ability to move quickly to address the issues COVID-19 had left it with. They have done that because they want us to crack on with it, or, as Americans and Canadians would say, get on with it. They want us to move with haste and speed on the recovery. They don't want too much complexity, so I'll be keeping all that in mind in the work we do. The Greens were hoping to be part of a strong, truly progressive government. Former Deputy Prime Minister New Zealand challenge will all have to wait and see. Ardern indicated Deputy Leader Kelvin Davis would become the new Deputy Prime Minister. The Association of Consumers and Taxpayers leader David Seymour was said to get about 10 MPs into Parliament. The simultaneously held referendums on the legalization of cannabis and euthanasia. Their results will be known several weeks from now because of the probably the large number of mail-in ballots, and of course because of the fact that they are controversial issues. New Zealand, like the neighbouring Australia, has had a traditional fairly moderate politics, although Australia has had clearly more populist right-wing politicians, both in its main centre-right and ruling centre-right party, the Liberal National Coalition, which also has been called, for example, the Liberal Country Coalition, and then in those small parties like Katter's Australia Party, and then the far-right One Nation Party of Pauline Hanson, and so forth. Although the National Party is classified as a centre-right party, it is clearly more liberal on social issues like abortion and homosexual or same-sex marriage, than is, for example, the US Republican Party. And there is, because of the profound secularization of New Zealand, no influential Christian right. Even in Australia, where it is more popular for the centre-right politicians like former Prime Minister Tony Abbott to openly oppose abortion, at least in principle, under most circumstances, there isn't that much of a Christian right, or in one of my 3 homelands, Canada. while in the United States, we can basically say that it's impossible to become the Republican Party's presidential candidate, especially without at least token support from the Christian right. So we'll move forward to the other analyses. This is from the Australian. Jacinda Ardern's dream run as New Zealand's leader is set to continue after her Labour Party romped home in a general election seen by many as a referendum on her handling on the COVID-19 crisis. In a historic win, the party looks to have secured enough seats to form a majority government without the help of a coalition partner, the first time that has happened since proportional representation was implemented effective with the 1996 parliamentary elections. It had been approved already in a referendum or direct vote by New Zealand's eligible voters back in 1993. The system was designed so that minor parties would get to play an influential role in New Zealand politics, and I would add, and so that the country would not suffer the kind of radical polarization of the electorate between the two main parties, one of whose worst examples currently is the United States, where millions of truly responsible people, US citizens, either don't vote at all or switch parties or vote for third parties or independent or write-in candidates. Why? Because they are so dissatisfied and fed up with the implication that you have to choose between the lesser of two evils. Who is the lesser one? At least in New Zealand, people have more choices. And actually, I, in principle, oppose a two-party dominant system, especially a radically two-party dominant system where the national or federal legislature virtually never has a single member from a third party. I much prefer a legislature that has at least 3 or 4, if not even 5 major parties to choose from, because the voters will have more choices. If I was a US citizen, I could not consistently support either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Why? Because the Democratic Party, aside from its pro-life wing, which thank God still exists and claims to have 21 million members, and claims that about 1/3 of the Democratic voters support the pro-life position. Anyway, in its mainstream, the US Democratic Party has become too liberal on such issues as abortion and same-sex marriage, in my opinion. Although there are several other issues on which I basically agree with the Democratic position, or at least I'm closer to it. For example, a fairer tax system, fairer for the working poor and the struggling working class and lower middle class taxpayers, where the rich would pay their fair share or fairer share in taxes, and a much more wholehearted and consistent condemnation of racism, xenophobia, and even discouragement of ethnocentrism, more foreign aid for the world's poor countries, the lowering of college and university tuition so that the smart and responsible children of even working and lower class families would have at least a chance to go to college or university after high school. And then a greater environmental protection, certainly. More focus on the rights of the disabled. And, a moderate form of affirmative action so that no qualified women or members of ethnic or racial minorities, or even religious ones, would be automatically in a worse position because of their gender, or ethnicity or race or religion. And then also an opposition to the merciless stigmatization of Muslims, as if all Muslims were, just because they identify as Muslims, automatically wicked and threatening people, which by human standards they aren't. And there are even many Muslims who are secretly interested in becoming Christians. but they are impeded from doing so because of the pressures of their communities. There are many moderate Muslims, many more than these uh, dangerous radicals, one of whom beheaded a French history and geography teacher uh, this Friday. The Labour Party might also have won some sympathy votes because of Prime Minister Ardern's strong condemnation of the Christchurch mosque attacks and of their perpetrator, the Australian-born far-right terrorist Brenton Tarrant, who was sentenced this September to life imprisonment without eligibility for parole. He pleaded guilty to the charges of 51 murders and tens of attempted murders and the illegal possession of firearms and so forth, but he showed no remorse. While, of course, no reasonable person in New Zealand or abroad linked any politician of the National Party to those attacks, Prime Minister Ardern, by swiftly condemning them and by affirming the equality of all law-abiding New Zealanders, regardless of their religion. She incidentally self-identifies as an agnostic. In other words, she has no firm belief in God, but she doesn't deny the possibility that God exists. That probably won the Labour Party some sympathy votes, although if Bill English had been the Prime Minister, probably he also would have got some sympathy votes. And maybe the fact that Jacinda Ardern at 40 years old is still a relatively young politician. She's a woman, she's a mother, although she's not married, and she claims to genuinely be in favor of increasing the opportunities of the lower and working classes. And maybe Mrs. Collins just was a too stereotypical center-right politician, not young enough at 61 years old, and maybe even her body build partly played into it, although that probably was a factor for only a fraction of the voters. And maybe the fact that her party had replaced her predecessor in desperation to have at least a remote chance of winning these elections. It has been a tumultuous, meaning containing many problems, 3 years in power for the now 40-year-old who has led New Zealand through the Christchurch terrorist attacks in March 2019, the Wakari White Island volcanic eruption, I think also in 2019, and then the pandemic. But the hard yards may be still ahead. Prime Minister Ardern may be a global celebrity renowned for her compassion and leadership during New Zealand's darkest years, but for people living in New Zealand, it is more complicated. When Jacinda first got elected, there was this sense of euphoria and ecstasy, and everyone was super excited, of course, being a relatively young politician and a woman at that, and the country's first female prime minister. Said Verity Johnson, a columnist with the Dominion Post and frequent commentator on youth issues. This time it's not so ecstatic. The 26-year-old recognizes that Jacinda Ardern has had quite a bit on her plate that no one could have foreseen, so she has had to deal with difficult issues during her 3-year prime ministership, with the nation gripped by domestic and global crises. She did it all after becoming a mother for the first time, less than a year into her first term in office. Yet that alone doesn't quite make up for the failure of Kiwi Build, a bold initiative to build 100,000 affordable homes, now a synonym for government failure. By August 2020, only around 600 homes had been built. Then there's the lack of progress on a light rail in Auckland, one of New Zealand's main cities. Initiatives young people in particular were crying out for. We're grateful, we're glad that she has won the election, Ms. Johnson said. But there is a quiet sense of disappointment that has taken off the stardust from this time last election, when we were all ecstatic and texting each other in nightclubs being like, yay, Jacinda got in. Labour's slogan in the election campaign was "Let's keep moving," a statement that seemed less inspirational and more an acknowledgement that they hadn't delivered. It's all a far cry from the transformational government Jacinda Ardern promised when she came to power. No one for a moment would believe that we could fix an issue that takes decades to build in 3 years, she said. The trouble is they did. Child poverty, which was one of the issues on which Mrs. Collins criticized uh, Prime Minister Ardern in at least one of the three televised election debates, by the way. They are still available on YouTube, at least two of them. The Prime Minister insists her government has made progress, but the increases on some key indicators of child welfare are so minimal, they are not considered statistically relevant. And for a rich Western style country, New Zealand ranks a shocking 35th out of 41 developed countries on the United Nations uh, Children's Emergency Funds or UNICEF's Child Wellbeing Report Card. The Labour government has really been a failure in terms of delivering on key promises, said Jennifer Lees Marshment, Associate Professor in Political Marketing at Auckland University. Although she was able to win that landslide victory, according to Associate Professor Lees Marshment, Prime Minister Ardern is going to face very difficult times going forward. That's the main challenge for the Labour government. They can't just be a manager of crisis and a really relatable leader as much as that has been successful to date, she said. They've really got to start fulfilling their desires of their supporters to make transformational change. The most immediate challenge, according to Associate Professor Lees Marshment, is getting the country out of recession and back on its feet after the coronavirus pandemic. Jacinda Ardern's mantra of go hard, go early on the pandemic may have kept the virus more or less at bay. And yes, according to the numbers available, for example, on the worldometers.info website, which is updated every day, that's true. But the strict lockdowns and border controls have threatened livelihoods. The country's gross domestic product, in other words, the estimated value of the goods and services produced in this case in New Zealand in 1 year, was down 12.2%, so 1/8 in the June quarter. The longer the crisis drags on, the more dissatisfaction could grow. Having solved the health aspect of COVID-19, she's still got to deal with the long-term economic crisis, which is the slower burn crisis, said Professor Lees Marshment. In a campaign light on policy details, it's not entirely clear how Labour intends to do that, aside from saying it will invest in shovel-ready infrastructure projects. The phrase doesn't sit easily with Verity Johnson. The youth commentator and columnist says not enough attention is being paid to helping out industries many women work in, including hospitality, retail, and tourism. These shovel-ready projects do sound quite skewed towards men, Ms. Johnson said. Women have been disproportionately affected by the coronavirus pandemic, and the situation is no different in New Zealand. 90% of people who lost their jobs to the COVID-19 crisis in New Zealand were women, according to official data. We want to know what's being done for the she-recession, or female recession, Ms. Johnson said. I would like to have seen more to be done on areas where women are working and less an emphasis on just giving men shovels. Political marketing expert Associate Professor Lees Marshment agrees Labour needs to formulate and deliver on some concrete policies soon. They need some new policy thinking and to start thinking outside the box, because this is not business as usual, she said. But Prime Minister Ardern, now one of her country's most successful politicians in decades, remains defiant and optimistic. I am not done yet. In other words, she hasn't yet completed her task, the Prime Minister promised ahead of the election. The electorate isn't done with her either, in trusting her to lead them out of this crisis. With New Zealand's election night over, though, the reckoning is just beginning. And let's see if channelnewsasia.com has anything to add. Well, a fresh-faced Jacinda Ardern entered office 3 years ago promising relentless positivity, and New Zealand's leader has needed it in abundance as a succession of catastrophes besieged the nation and tested her mettle. Along the way, she also had a baby and became the international standard bearer for progressive politics in an era of right-wing populist strongmen. Yes, right-wing populists definitely were badly beaten in this parliamentary election. Ardern had been in office barely 18 months when, in March 2019, a white supremacist, Brenton Tarrant, opened fire in 2 Christchurch mosques during Friday prayers, killing 51 Muslim worshippers and wounding another 40. Her deft and compassionate response to the gunman's rampage of hate defined the charismatic center-left leader's image around the world. But she also won plaudits for decisive policy action, including swiftly enacted gun law reforms and a push to force social media giants to address online hate speech. The New Zealand public used the October the 17th general election to emphatically back the 40-year-old's performance, giving her a second 3-year term in office. Life within New Zealand has largely returned to normal after a strict lockdown earlier in 2020, barring a brief outbreak in Auckland that has now been contained. The success helped Ardern win a poll she dubbed the COVID election, and the 55% personal approval rating she recorded in opinion polls ahead of the vote demonstrates the bond she has forged with fellow Kiwis or New Zealanders in tough times. Ardern grew up in the North Island hinterland, so away from the Pacific coasts, where her father was a police officer. She credits the poverty she saw there with shaping her beliefs. She was raised as a Mormon, but left the religion in her 20s due to its stance against homosexuality. After completing a communications degree, Ardern began her political career in former Prime Minister Helen Clark's office before heading to Britain to work as a policy advisor in former Prime Minister Tony Blair's government. In 2008, she was elected to the New Zealand Parliament. She was then only 28 years old. And in March 2017, she became the Labour Party's deputy leader, saying at the time that she was not ambitious and saw herself as a backroom staffer. Ardern transformed from self-described policy nerd to prime minister on a wave of Jacinda mania after being thrust into the Labour leadership just 7 weeks before the 2017 election. So we can say that the National Party attempted the same gamble, but it didn't work, despite the fact that Judith Collins has more political experience and more age than Jacinda Ardern. She made headlines again in 2018 when she became only the second prime minister in the world to give birth while in office after Pakistan's assassinated Benazir Ali Bhutto in 1990. After Christchurch, she again offered comfort to the nation when the White Island, also known as Wakari, volcano erupted in December 2019, killing 21 people and leaving tens more with horrific burns. Ardern has constantly urged New Zealanders during the coronavirus crisis to be kind, appealing for a unified approach from what she terms a team of 5 million. New Zealand has a population of slightly under 5 million. By contrast, my distant native land, Finland, has over 5.5 million people. In Northern Europe, my second native land, Canada, has almost 38 million people, and according to the official statistics, I think the Philippines, my current homeland, has over 109 or about 110 million. I'm reminded of the late US President George Bush Sr.'s campaign slogan during his 1988 successful election campaign. He campaigned for a kinder and gentler nation. And he spoke of the many volunteer organizations in the United States as 1,000 points of light. One high profile fan of Prime Minister Ardern is the famous US talk show host Oprah Winfrey, who in 2019 held up Ardern as a model of compassion and grace under pressure. Let's see if Euronews has anything substantial to add. Up the COVID-19 pandemic. But now the hard work lies ahead. And let's hope and pray that above all, Prime Minister Ardern will ask the good Lord for help.